It was about 12 miles from our Atlantic Highlands anchorage to the Verrazano Bridge, which is sort of the gateway to the New York Harbor area. Although a nautical chart has a confusing array of marked channels crisscrossing this area, a pleasure boat can pretty much just cut right through it all in a straight line. After passing under the Verrazano Bridge, we initially hugged the eastern shore of New York Harbor. The western shore of the harbor here is mostly commercial ship terminals, tugs, and barges. Many of the barges were at anchor. Eventually, we crossed over to the western shore of the New York Harbor area so we could get a good look at the Statue of Liberty, which is located about here. In addition to pleasure boats, there were lots of tugs, ferry boats, and tour boats to keep the helmsman from getting bored. We continued to hug the western shore as we followed the Hudson River upstream. This gave us a good view of the forest of tall buildings that fills every square inch of Manhattan. It took a while, but the high-density area of New York City eventually started to fade out as we cruised further up the Hudson River. We began seeing more trees and high bluffs along the river. We eventually anchored for the day off Hook Mountain State Park. It was an exposed anchorage, but we were to discover that most anchorages on the Hudson River were exposed in at least one direction. Winds were light, and we had a pretty good night, other than the wake from the occasional tug and barge. Dave and I had a nice hike on Friday morning before continuing our journey up the Hudson. We stopped in Haverstraw for some fuel, then followed the tug and barge upriver. The hills were getting much bigger as we got further from the coastal lowlands. In the afternoon, we passed the military academy at West Point. The place was huge. It looked more like a small city than a college. We initially intended to anchor here, near Bannerman Castle, but we found the exposure and the water depths not to our liking. We continued upriver, investigating several potential anchoring spots along the way. We eventually ended up dropping the hook here, northeast of the Chelsea Marina. The water depths were acceptable, and we were well away from the shipping channel. It was another exposed anchorage, but once again the wind was very cooperative that night. And we had a front row seat to view the many passing Amtrak trains. When Dave pulled the anchor up Saturday morning, enough wood came up with it to build a small house. We had a relatively short day on the water, reaching Shadows Marina in Poughkeepsie around lunchtime. Since the marina was not close to either restaurants or grocery stores, we took a long walk to a Mexican restaurant, then did some grocery shopping next door, then took a cab back to the boat. We departed Poughkeepsie Sunday morning and motored upriver until we eventually reached the town of Catskill. There was a good anchorage on the east side of the river, and we got the anchor down just before a small thunderstorm moved through the area. A cool north wind had chased away the clouds when we continued upriver Monday morning. Fortunately, there were enough twists and turns in the Hudson that the north wind was not a problem for us. We paused for a while at the city dock in Albany, which is free, but limits you to a 2-hour stay. When our dock time was up, Dave cast off the lines and we continued upriver, looking for a place to spend the night. My initial anchorage idea proved unacceptable, and we found ourselves forced further and further up the Hudson. A short distance upstream of Albany is the city of Troy. And a short distance above Troy is the first of about a dozen locks we would eventually need to pass through. And a short distance above that first lock was a bridge that my mast would not fit under. Also, eventually, we would encounter low bridges that my upper deck sunbrella enclosure would not fit under. There were two ways to handle this situation. The way I should have handled the situation was to lower the mast during our brief stop in Albany, then pass through the first lock, then tie up in Waterford for the night, and then take off the upper deck sunbrella enclosure the following day. The way I actually ended up doing it was to stop for the night at the Troy cement bulkhead, lower the mast, and take off the sunbrella enclosure from the upper deck. The problem with this strategy was the cement wall. We discovered that as the tide fell, the lower section of the cement wall was undercut. If there had been much wind or passing boat traffic that night, it could have easily messed up my boat. As it turned out, all I lost was some sleep as I made sure the fenders remained where they needed to be throughout the night. The next morning, we headed into the first of many locks. That first lock was kind of scary, but with Dave's help, we made it through just fine. However, our crises of the day had nothing to do with locks. The previous evening, my cell phone had taken a fatal plunge into the Hudson River. Also, my Wi-Fi was not charging, and it refused to do anything more until it got some additional electricity inside of it. We made sort of a spur-of-the-moment decision to pull into Waterford and deal with my connectivity issues. A few hours and several $100s later, both my connectivity issues were resolved. Waterford is a busy place as far as water is concerned. The Hudson River and the Champlain Canal take off here. The Mohawk River takes off here. The locks for the Erie Canal take off here, although the Erie Canal rejoins the Mohawk River further upstream. Last but not least, an older, now abandoned segment of the Champlain Canal can be found here, with a really nice walking trail that runs alongside of it. Waterford had free docking at their city bulkhead, so we stayed there overnight. It was a nice little town with restaurants, grocery stores, and a great walking trail. Although I didn't take advantage of it, Waterford also offers boaters an electrical hookup for only $10. The only catch is that you are limited to a 48-hour stay. After my morning walk on Wednesday, Dave and I headed out to do battle with a few more locks before tying up for the day in Mechanicsville. This is another example of a river town that offers a free dock to boating visitors for 48 hours. Since rain was in the forecast, we stayed here the full 48 hours to do some laundry, buy some groceries, and eat too much food at a restaurant down the street. We got going again on Friday morning, which turned out to be a relatively short day. Mr. Big is right. We passed through a few more locks and tied up just past our last lock at a free dock at Hudson Crossing Park. The dock was peaceful enough, but had no water or electrical hookups. The park is located on a pretty good-sized island. There was the potential for a fairly long hike on the trail, but this being summer, you needed to take the usual precautions to avoid becoming dinner for the local insect population. There is also a very nice footpath that follows an old abandoned section of the Champlain Canal into the town of Sugarville. There are a couple shops and restaurants in the sleepy little town, but not much. I was interested to discover that there was a hiking and biking trail that went for some distance along the Champlain Canal. Kayakers can also use the Champlain Canal. On Saturday morning, we headed upriver again to Fort Edward. It is here that the Hudson River goes one direction and the Champlain Canal goes another direction.
I can watch stuff like that all day long and still not really understand it.
There are two free city docks in Fort Edward. The one we used on the Champlain Canal side had no water or electricity. On the Hudson River side of town, there is a much nicer city bulkhead with water and electricity. The original fort, now long gone, was built during the French and Indian War. Dave and I walked over to the visitor center and learned more about the history of the fort. There were also various historical signs scattered around town, including the usual "George Washington slept here" sign. There were a couple places to eat in town, but if you need groceries, you will have to make do with a quickie store. Fort Edward was also the location where my generator decided not to start and where my hydraulic steering decided to go on strike. We were eventually able to get everything working again, but it was not a fun process in all that summer heat. Sunday turned out to be a brutally hot and humid afternoon. To make matters worse, we were directly exposed to the sunlight, since the upper deck sunbrella enclosure had been removed to allow us to get under the low canal bridges. Dave and I were both feeling pretty beat up from the heat by the time we pulled into Whitehall. Fortunately, the free city bulkhead had both water and electricity, so we could fire up my boat's air conditioner. Also, the building ashore, where the bathrooms were located, was air conditioned. I think I spent over an hour in that building, getting a shower, drinking water, and cooling off. Although the town of Whitehall seemed to be in financial and population decline, the town appeared to have invested its last tax dollars on some unusually nice waterfront facilities, including a park, a local museum, and an activity center. The town also has an Amtrak stop, so it would be a convenient location to change crew. Grocery stores were lacking, but there were a couple places to eat.